Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you?
In 12 AD, Polynesians arrived on what would later be known as Easter Island, the island that is now famous for having these giant stone head thingies. The Polynesian boats carried rats from faraway lands, which wiped out much of the native wildlife. On top of that, the people began cutting down the palm trees that cloaked the island, which resulted in soil erosion, making future agriculture difficult. The abundance of resources and strive to produce these great monuments would spell doom, eventually resulting in famine and collapse before Europeans arrived. From this perspective, the stone heads are a testament not only to the brilliant craftsmanship of the people here, but also their hubris. It is also a testament to how Mother Nature gives her children a spanking when they misbehave. But maybe this wasn't the case. More recent evidence points to a population that, while engaging in some exploitation of the environment, did manage to find innovative ways to deal with the change in their environment, both caused by themselves and forces beyond their control. The Polynesians eventually switched from wood to stone tools and managed to find excess groundwater. Humanity's relationship with our natural environment is as old as humanity itself. Apologies for being Captain Obvious. In a previous video, I covered the subject of human extinction at the hands of natural events of which we have no control over. Events like meteors, supervolcanoes, and gamma-ray bursts. In all of those scenarios, humans lack any agency in their downfall. Sure, we would fall, but we cannot blame ourselves. If one of these events does wipe out our civilization, at least the survivors, if they exist, can tell themselves that it wasn't our fault. But what if humans themselves caused environmental catastrophe that led to the destruction of human civilization and perhaps the species as a whole? In this scenario, we can't take comfort in blaming an external force. But at the same time, events which are caused by our own actions show us that we human beings have agency, and with that agency we are given responsibility and power. This video is part of a series of videos on potential human extinction events. I've already covered pandemics, supervolcanoes, and demographic decline. In this video, we are going to cover environmental catastrophes caused by human choices, namely anthropogenic climate change. Out of all the scenarios I've discussed, this is probably the most likely to happen out of all of them, perhaps only rivaled by nuclear war. Even then, whether or not it could cause human extinction is up for debate, and perhaps alarmism gets more attention than sober analysis. Now, humans making shitty decisions regarding their natural environment, which leads to destructive unintended consequences, is nothing new. There is a misconception that hunter-gatherer peoples before the dawn of civilization, and for that matter industrialization, lived in harmony with nature. This is just flat out BS. Fossil records show us that the arrival of humans in new biomes led to the extinction of most of the very large megafauna, as these large beasts were hard to miss and they had long gestation periods. Australia was hit the hardest due to this isolation. This may explain why Africa is the one continent which kept most of its terrestrial megafauna, as the large animals there were more likely to respond to humans with fear and aggression since they'd been accustomed to us, stabbing them. Complex societies managed to avoid many of the worst elements Mother Nature threw at them by building cities. However, this also led to new challenges, as settlements are highly dependent on their location, which can be subject to floods, droughts, and other disasters. In what is arguably the oldest written story in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the king of the Sumerian city-state of Uruk and his friend Enkidu cut down the cedar forests, which result in the gods cursing them with wildfires and drought. While the story is fictional, it most likely was inspired by widespread fires and desertification caused by deforestation at the hands of this ancient civilization. Perhaps the angry bearded guys in the sky didn't exist, but the story contains a great deal of truth. Ancient Sumerians, being the first civilization to record their stories and dwell in large cities, were the first people to make a natural versus artificial distinction. They were the first to notice differences between the world of the elements and the new world humans created using those aforementioned elements. They were also the first to be aware of how their new artificial world was built to protect them from the old world, but also that their utilization of the natural world's resources could lead to devastating consequences for their new artificial world. The overuse of irrigation in Mesopotamia would result in higher rates of soil salinity around the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Today, those rivers are dying out, and most likely this will lead to the decay of the modern state of Iraq. Ecological exploitation is a common trend throughout human history. However, it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution when this went full throttle. During the 1800s in England, steam engines and other machines would be invented using power by coal, and later gas and oil. The combustion of these fossil fuels resulted in greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane, which absorb infrared radiation, otherwise known as heat. Ever heard of it? This leads us to what we used to call global warming, but today it's usually referred to as climate change. The reason why they are called fossil fuels is because they were produced by past mass extinctions during the Carboniferous era, the age of giant plants. Those memes about plastic toy dinosaurs being made out of oil, which in turn are made out of the bodies of real dinosaurs, are partly true, but oil is actually much older than dinosaurs, like millions upon millions of years older. And the byproduct of this mass extinction of the age of ferns and giant insects is now causing a new mass extinction of animals on the planet, as some of the most biodiverse ecosystems are being hit the hardest, such as coral reefs. The rising temperatures by a few degrees results in coral polyps ejecting algae, which is required to produce color and, more importantly, energy, resulting in coral bleaching. Speaking of coral reefs, the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere also leads to ocean acidification as the pH increases. Acidity prevents carbonate ions from producing shells for various invertebrates, which are vital for food chains as well as for coastal communities. It's only a matter of time when you can sip the seawater and you'll be like, lemony. I guess the politicians will only start caring about the environment when the ocean tastes less like seawater and more like 7-Up mixed with vinegar. And it won't even be good 7-Up, since global warming will make sure that it's pretty hot and warm soda is pretty gross. Putting shit jokes aside, let's move on to the destruction of coral reefs and mangroves. The destruction of coral reefs and mangroves not only leads to a loss of biodiversity and food supplies, but also flooding, as these ecosystems act as shock absorbers for waves in the tropics and subtropics. Coastal flooding will lead to various cities being inundated with floods in Africa, Florida, and other parts of the Third World. It shouldn't hurt their tourism industry, though. Miami will look like Venice, Disneyland will just have to switch from being a theme park to a water park, and SeaWorld will just be the fucking sea. Soon, it will be so hot your armpits will turn into waterfalls, contributing to flooding and salinity. Humans love water, but not too much water. The rising temperatures are also currently melting ice caps, mostly in the Arctic, namely in Greenland and Nunavut, and to a lesser extent in Antarctica. A few degrees warmer might sound nice if you live in southern Canada, but it will be devastating further north into the Arctic Circle. A few degrees higher on a grassland might not be that much of a difference, but in the Arctic, it completely transforms the physical landscape of the ecosystem, turning sheets of ice into open ocean. Most Arctic wildlife exists on the borders of ice and water, after all, and this is where we get the iconic pictures of polar bears starving on isolated chunks of ice. Images like these have become emblematic of climate change in a way to explain the crisis to children. The subarctic is arguably even worse, as permafrost, which is basically frozen soil, releases methane. This results in a feedback loop in which temperatures rise, permafrost melts, methane is released, and methane absorbs more heat, and so on, and so on, and so forth. On top of that, white snow doesn't absorb as much heat as brown soil does. Very few people live in the tundra, as it sucks to tan in negative 30 degrees, though. The same is not true for most temperate and tropical coastal areas. A large number of our most important cities are on coastal plains. Some low-lying nations like the Netherlands have advanced systems of dikes and levees, which can withstand rising temperatures. But others don't have this. I predict that the largest refugee crisis of this century will probably be in Bangladesh, which has a population larger than Russia's in a country roughly the same size as Florida on a floodplain like Florida. Unlike the Netherlands, Bangladesh doesn't have advanced flood control systems. This would result in mass deaths followed by a refugee crisis that would ravage India and surrounding nations, which would also be in turn devastated by their rising sea tides. Nigeria is another location bound to be hit hard as the city of Lagos sits on the Atlantic coast. Climate change will probably hit the tropics harder, and the tropics, after all, are predominantly made up of developing countries with poor infrastructure. In the Middle East and other arid parts of the world, you will probably see a different set of problems. We've all heard of wildfires in parts of the world that are hot, dry, and forested like California and parts of Australia, but in places without forests, you're likely to see really terrible droughts. Some of the wealthy Gulf states will be able to mitigate this through advanced infrastructure. However, some of the methods of mitigating the problem have a mixed record. The most infamous example were the Dubai floods, in which most of the city was cloaked in a pile of water caused by artificial cloud seeding in plains, which is the result of releasing silver iodide, which allows water to condense around particles, and once that water is kept in clouds, it becomes very heavy, and you get rain, and in some cases, you get too much rain. Apologies for the run-on sentence, but there are some examples of this working. For example, in Iran, a country with some of the worst water mismanagement in the world, the government managed to temporarily delay a water crisis in the capital city of Tehran through, again, cloud seeding. But this is just a piecemeal measure and not a long-term solution. All of these current coming disasters are bound to cause political instability with large sums of refugees, along with people lacking shelter, food, water, and other essentials. This will most likely cause civil strife, along with neighboring countries fighting over limited resources. Some potential conflicts would be a water war between Egypt and Ethiopia over downward access to the Nile River water system. Another flashpoint would be between India and China. The Chinese are already building dams which will give them leverage over their regional rival, India. These dams are mostly built in the Himalayas. After all, the Himalayas contain a giant number of colossal glaciers that turn into rivers with sediments that not only provide the populations with water, but also with the minerals required to farm. India and China have already had a history of minor small clashes and small-scale wars in the past, and it's likely that these will only be exacerbated in the future. Meanwhile, in the United States, the military experts have been at the forefront of climate-induced conflicts. In the book, All Hell Breaks Loose, the author makes a compelling case that while many American politicians deny anthropogenic climate change, American generals, who will have to be making decisions about global conflicts, do not have the luxury of deluding themselves. This leads us to the subject of geoengineering, which is an alternative or perhaps side solution to the conventional methods of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. While reducing carbon and methane emissions requires long-term, multinational negotiations, which have been proven to be extremely hard to implement, let alone enforce, geoengineering can be quick and easy. Granted, it may also have unintended consequences. Some of these methods involve direct CO2 capture using either A, a mechanical approach, B, mass reforestation by simply planting trees, and C, ocean fertilization, which is quite possibly the most bizarre, in which you add a ton of iron into the oceans to produce a bloom of phytoplankton, so that these critters lower CO2 as they're technically plants like trees. The mechanical method would be very expensive using our current technology. The reforestation method only works in tropical and temperate climates. It turns out that planting trees in boreal forests up in the subarctic actually increases temperatures, as green trees absorb more heat than white snow. The plankton method can also lead to more ecological disruption, so that's quite possibly the most controversial of all. Granted, with more phytoplankton, you'll get more zooplankton, and then maybe we'll save the whales that way. Anyway, another method of geoengineering would be stratospheric aerosol injection, in which we add reflective particles into the upper atmosphere or even mirrors. This deflects sunlight and heat away from the Earth. Funny enough, this would have a similar effect to a volcanic winter, just without the gigantic explosion. At our current state, geoengineering is still being debated. The conventional view is that the risks are too high and the trade-offs are not worth it. Granted, if the conventional approach of aiming for emission reductions continues to be lackluster, and if concepts like net zero emissions prove to be unrealistic, then geoengineering will probably be taken more seriously. On a less cynical note, we have already seen issues being resolved with technological change. For example, obesity is a problem deeply intertwined into the human psyche, our desire to consume highly caloric food. Countless efforts to reduce the epidemic of people guzzling deep-fried mayo didn't seem to work. However, with the rise of technology in the form of Ozempic and similar drugs, we have now seen a decline in obesity rates. After all, climate change is kind of similar in the way that it's a problem that is very, very difficult for the human psyche to fathom. The human mind is wired to perceive threats which occur rapidly and obviously, like a predatory animal. This is why wars get so much attention, but something as boring as the rise of a few degrees in temperature does not. Climate change is global, relatively slow, and gradual. It's hard to visualize compared to other threats until the situation gets so bad, such as an increase in natural disasters, and even then, it's hard to tie those things together. A climatic extinction event, more than any other scenario, fits into the parable of the frog slowly boiling in a pot. And this time, I guess boiling in the atmosphere. I guess you can't really boil in an atmosphere because the atmosphere isn't liquid. I'm already failing my middle school science education, sorry. Speaking of people who have become very controversial in the scientific community, in 2001, Bjorn Lomborg released the book The Skeptical Environmentalist, in which he argued that while climate change is real and a product of human activity, much of the discourse around human extinction events has devolved into doomerism, and that geoengineering should be implemented rather than focusing on emissions reductions. The book was widely criticized by many scientists but praised by those who believe that the current warnings are excessively pessimistic. Is Bjorn right? Is he wrong? I don't know. I personally believe climate change will result in mass disruption, particularly in tropical regions of the world, particularly those with densely populated areas with floodplains. The ecological crisis will be compounded with civil strife and conflict. However, would it really lead to the extinction of humanity? Probably not. Climate change is already here, so perhaps we will use the combination of nuclear and green technology to reduce emissions alongside some low-risk forms of geoengineering. The reason why I don't think this will result in human extinction or even the collapse in human civilization is that humans are extremely resilient, and we have survived nearly every terrestrial biome on the planet. Other creatures will perish, unfortunately, due to an ongoing sixth-mass extinction, but this will also open up niches for new adaptive and resilient species to fill in. Or perhaps old species to fill in. I mean, look how successful pigeons are in our cities. The term saving the planet doesn't make much sense as the planet doesn't need saving, and it's been through far worse than some methane gas in the air. I mean, there was a point where it was once covered in lava. Not exactly the best real estate. While we don't need to save the planet, and to be clear, the planet is not particularly interested in saving us, we can save ourselves. Jacques Cousteau once said that throughout most of history, man had to fight nature to survive. In this century, he is beginning to realize that in order to survive, he must protect it.